out round of this tournament, as you may have heard, this first out round of the tournament is different from all other future first out rounds. So congratulations on making it here the old-fashioned way. In opening government, we have the team from Oxford A. In opening opposition, BPPA. In closing government, Cambridge A. And in closing opposition, ULU A. And with that said, I now call this House to order and call upon the Prime Minister to open up the round. Take that microphone.
This one.
Let's just wait until we get confirmation on these microphones. Can each team test their microphone? Yes. Let's take turns. No, I can tell the order.
석준한테만 비디오 주자.
This one does.
Yeah, it does.
Thanks for reminding me. When a small number of rich and powerful individuals are able to capture the news media and prevent a wide range of opinions being formed, prevent major stories about political corruption or incompetence ever getting out, democracy is seriously threatened. That's something that an opening government today we're going to stand to prevent. I'm going to bring you two things in my speech. Firstly, why media monopolies and oligopolies distort and prevent the ability to challenge both media corporations and the political and corporate interests that they support, why that's incredibly harmful for our democracy. Secondly, I'm going to explain why high barriers to entry in the news media sector require this kind of intervention. In terms of a model, very briefly, we think it's fairly obvious. Holding corporations are not going to be allowed to hold more than one newspaper or TV channel, whatever it is, across different sectors. In terms of who will regulate that, it will be like the FCC in the United States, Ofcom in the United Kingdom, whoever the regulatory body is. We're going to force them to divest pretty much immediately the assets that they currently hold. Jack.
And presumably that applies to any kind of TV channel, right? Like any channel of any kind of description.
No, ones that do news, the Cartoon Network and also Sky, but if you're doing news, then that's the one that's problematic. So, first, why does this distort the ability to challenge and critique media corporations and the political interests that they represent? Firstly, why do these organisations represent clear social interests? Why is that damaging? There's an obvious class point to be made just at base here, that if you look at News Corp, the two largest shareholders are Rupert Murdoch and a very wealthy Saudi Arabian prince. They represent clear social interests. But more than that, often you get distinct ideological preferences representing distinct, just like random individual preferences. Silvio Berlusconi didn't actually represent accused capitalists. He just used his ownership of that news channel to entrench his own political power. Moreover, because stock holdings in these corporations are often like rich hedge funds or so on that own lots of other corporations, what you get is powerful corporations across different sectors, all being represented by one news media organisation. The other reason this is harmful is that oftentimes corrupt and immoral journalism just never comes out, because there's a very small number of news media organisations available to critique those things. How do these media organisations do that? Firstly, because when you hold multiple media, multiple newspapers or TV channels across different forms of media, or like a tabloid and a broadsheet, you're able to get more social groups believing the facts that you have decided are the relevant facts about the world, or more people believing your ideological opinions. Secondly, because these kind of hegemonies are much more difficult to regulate. So you get things like the fact that all the regulators on the FCC later expect to go and leave the FCC and work for one of two big media organisations. That means they're much less likely to do things that are damaging to those interests. So you don't get people challenging big corporations. The same thing goes for politicians, because there are no alternative sources for them to appeal to fight the kind of like bad reporting that might happen about them and their careers. Third reason, journalists and editors have massively weakened career prospects if they ever speak out against things like News Corporation, if they ever write a damaging article about them. Why? Because now they know that immediately 50% of the major newspapers in the United Kingdom will never employ them again. And fourthly, because these groups are able to marshal numerous voters who just listen to their one newspaper or TV channel behind a particular cause. Why does this policy solve that? No thanks, officer. Firstly, because it just creates more space for the possibility that different kinds of views and different kinds of preferences will be expressed, because you don't get these continuous editorial policies running across different media organisations. Even if you think that some of the opinions expressed under our model will be similar, there is at the very least a considerable possibility that on issues that don't directly relate to things like corporate interests, they will express a plurality of different opinions. Moreover, though, because newspapers now have an incentive to seek out different stories in a way that they don't currently, because they need to beat the market, as it were, and just be the first people that find the story. At the moment, investigative journalism often gets lazy because there are so few organisations actually out there doing that kind of investigative journalism. Oscar.
Well, we might be willing, perhaps, to concede that Berlusconi and Murdoch have problems, but why do you want to break the BBC and the cooperative owns the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and the San Francisco Chronicle? What are the problems there?
For exactly the same reasons we've already outlined, that those things represent distinct ideological preferences that we are opposed to having too much play in the media market. We think it's important in general for democracy that we get a wide plurality of views being expressed. Because whatever you think the justification for democracy is, whether or not it's individual autonomy, whether or not it's that more people talking about more different things make better decisions, that requires that many different interests and opinions be in play in the media sector, be being discussed in order to make your democracy function properly. Even the cooperative that runs the New York Times, for instance, or the BBC, will often represent a particular set of social or cultural or ideological interests. Those things are just as damaging. Although we would point out that those organisations, probably in fact are less dominant than things like News Corp. Fox News, basically represents an enormous international news organisation which controls, News Corp controls the news media in multiple different countries. Secondly, barriers to entry. Why are they high? Why do they need to be broken down? The first thing is there's very considerable economies of scale in news gathering that makes it very hard for any new entrant into the market to ever get access to that kind of news unless they're given it by a bigger news organisation. So it's very, very expensive. Things like running newsrooms that actually go out and collect information. These organisations are able to apply massive economies of scale well out of time, and so are able to do considerable damage to new competitors in that sense. Secondly, because owning multiple different media outlets allows them to reference each other. Often the same kinds of reporting that happen on Fox will also be written about in the Sun or in the Murdoch papers. That means these organisations are able to reference each other, so it makes it very hard for new media organisations to ever get access to that kind of public discourse. Finally, though, because stuff like new media, right, things like blogs or people tweeting or whatever it is, you think might provide a diverse range of information, actually get most of their play to the vast majority of the population when big media choose to pick them up and choose to write about them. That's why we see things like political blogs like 538 or Real Clear Politics in the US actually getting a vast majority of their play because at some point MSNBC or whoever else it is picked them up and started talking about them on air. That means that ultimately these media corporations are not only able to represent powerful and dangerous interests of democracy, but also able to shut out other people in the market. That's damaging, we propose.
I thank the Prime Minister and now invite the Leader of the Opposition to deliver the next speech.
So what we're going to bring from opening opposition are two things. First of all, why this would lead to no newspapers because you require massive cross-subsidies in order to be able to get access to the market in order to engage and compete with entrenched interests. Secondly, why this is going to lead to reliance on big business purely and prevent companies from being able to challenge those elite interests, both in terms of news and in terms of cultural projects and investigative journalism. First of all, let's be clear what we stand for on opening opposition. We do stand for substantial protection to prevent the creation of media monopolies and substantial strengthening of things like the Independent Press Complaints Commission to prevent people like Rupert Murdoch gaining complete control of this kind of thing. It is not enough to say simply that media monopolies exist. We're happy to break them up if they do constitute complete monopolies. Secondly, we're also happy to have things like press partisan restrictions and limitations on levels of editorial control available to CEOs, available to things like Fox. We are not going to say that Rupert Murdoch should have unfettered control of media on our side of the house, simply that in order to have effective journalism, we need to make sure that we can make that profitable for as many entrants to the market as is possible. So, firstly, just one thing in terms of rebuttal that doesn't fit into that structure, these guys tell us that regulation capture occurs when you have large corporations. The reality is that regulation capture occurs because people do not want to speak out because no paper wants to employ somebody who tries to prevent newspapers from speaking. That is always going to lead to some degree of regulation capture. The fact that there are a large number of competitors or a small number of competitors makes no difference because nobody wants to employ a whistleblower. No. So, firstly, the rest of the rebuttal will be integrated. So firstly, in terms of newspapers, note, Mr. Speaker, that there is a single profitable newspaper in the United Kingdom. Every single other one is reliant on cross-subsidies by things like TV channels, by things like outside revenues from other newspapers, so for example, The Times can only exist because it has The Sun essentially subsidising this. What happens when you lose this policy? Firstly, you lose out on a huge number of newspapers that are incapable of representing other views. The point is, it's true, right, that the Times, companies like newspapers like The Times and The Sun do represent a right-wing agenda, but they represent different spectrums along that right-wing agenda, right? There are lots of different ideas that people are able to engage in. On their side of the house, you reduce that level of differentiation, because now you only have one populist newspaper that has to stay profitable. In that circumstance, it may be, right, that we do get more right-wing newspapers on our side of the house, but that means that you have more journalists expressing different views along that spectrum that people are able to engage with. Secondly, note that lots of these newspapers still compete, right? Because they still have institutional cultures that means that they want to have career progressions and they want to be able to attract readers to their newspaper, right? They want to ensure that they are the ones being read. In that circumstance, you still have competition between newspapers, but they then cross-fund each other in order to ensure that journalism happens in the first place. It is not true simply that these newspapers are mouthpieces for Rupert Murdoch. They instead engage in long-term investigative journalism in order to make sure that lots of things come out that are counter to things like government interests. No thanks. Now, it may be true that in media monopolies you wouldn't get certain newspapers coming out. That's why we're happy to ban those monopolies. In circumstances where you have more than one newspaper, there are always likely to be competitors to make sure that controversial stories do come out. You don't get that kind of capture, but you do get newspapers coming out. What's more, they still cross-report on each other, which is why corruption in the Sun was reported on by the Times, right? Even when they are owned by the same person, provided you have effective limitations on editorial control, you have the funds and the ability to be able to go against these guys. Secondly, in terms of this also works in terms of raising the barriers to entry. Because no, Mr. Speaker, that private capital is almost never available in order to start a newspaper because these companies are seen as systemically unprofitable and highly risky. In that case, you get one of two things occurring. Firstly, you might get things like micro-blogs that they want to talk about, but those are far less reliable in the standards of journalism that they are able to present because they do not have the funds to be able to do so. Or secondly, you get reliance on advertising. I'll tell you why that's a problem in a second. First of all, Ben.
But the reason private capital never enters is that it's effectively impossible for them to challenge the hegemony of oligopolistic markets. That changes under our model.
No, it's not that. It's because not enough people decide to read newspapers, right? Those are dying media, which means it means one of three things. Either you don't get any private capital, or you need cross-subsidies, or you need to charge progressively more, like things like the New York Times and the Financial Times, putting their content behind a pay screen. In that circumstance, you make it such that poor people can never access this journalism in the first place. We think it is a terrible idea to ensure that people can't access any information or any good standard of journalism because you don't get that necessary cross-subsidy through populism. But what's more, now you have reliance on advertising, right? You have to, in order to be able to fund your newspaper or fund your TV channel, you have to be able to attract big business towards you in order to be able to pay for you to be able to present the standard of content you want. In that circumstance, you have far less accountability than more, because every corporation now becomes risk-averse to the prospect of upsetting corporations. Firstly, because that corporation may advertise, but secondly, if you have the reputation of somebody who goes against corporate interests, nobody wants to try and fund that and ensure that they might be the one who's next. In that circumstance, you have far worse access to information because there is complete capture by elites. You now no longer have a populist newspaper capable of subsidising other investigative journalism because recognise that, like, the interest of a media oligarch is not always correlative with the interest of all elites or all rich people. In that circumstance, you break that down. Finally, in terms of cultural projects, note that institutions like the BBC are able to run, by running things like world content online, by selling their content, they're able to run things like the World Service, like BBC4, which are able to engage in the kinds of cultural projects which are easily accessible to individuals in order to widen the scope of their horizons and enable them to better engage with the outside world. You lose that at the point at which there is no ability to subsidise it, or you make it entirely contingent on the taxpayer. These guys hate Silvio Berlusconi. The reality is that Berlusconi was able to assert media control because he had complete control of state media and there was nobody there to challenge it. When you don't have the ability to cross-subsidise, you lose that ability to make challenge to the market. Mr. Speaker, it is true it would be better if we all had lots of newspapers and they're all self-owned. In the real world, they are not profitable, and so you need to prevent capture by elites or capture by big business. I am very happy to oppose.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition, and now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the round.
Okay, so what we get from Jack is a case that is remarkably unresponsive to ours, that rather includes a list of different harms that don't take into account the fact that the structure of the market is fundamentally changed by our proposition. After being the first person in this debate to respond, I will bring you 2 points of substantive. Firstly, I will talk about international interests, having a US or an Australian multinational own the news media across the world may be bad for various people. And secondly, I'm going to take a look at the idea of a false appearance of diversity, how the spectrum of right-wing views of lots of different reasons to support the Iraq war that Jack supports may in fact not be one that is great for democracy. Before that, various points of rebuttal. As regards the BBC or whoever, just because you like the views that certain media oligopolies put forward, just because the BBC may have very fuzzy and left-wing people like putting forward a monopoly of views, doesn't mean that ordinary people oughtn't have diversity and a plurality of views to take account of. That's a response to the second problem. Secondly, as regard them being like against monopolies in general and pro-regulation, a few things here. Firstly, that doesn't take into account the fact that, as Ben already told you, regulation is harder to do when you allow a single organisation to own multiple channels, right? Because people want to go into careers in the media and don't want to anger Rupert Murdoch. He tells you, oh, well, people just dislike whistleblowers in general. The point is, these people aren't whistleblowers, they're regulators who work in regulation. And other news corporations will be very happy with these people if they crack down appropriately on their rivals. No, thank you. Moreover, when you have more than one ideological interest at play, people won't have a knee-jerk reaction against these individuals for, say, not coming down on the side of, like, you know, the Iraq War, or George W. Bush, or Silvio Berlusconi, or whatever it is. No, thank you. We don't think other Italian capitalists who might have funded other Italian news organizations would have been angry with someone who stopped Silvio Berlusconi from like, plowing that country into the ground. No, thank you. We think they might have been very happy to employ them later. No. They tell you, oh, well, you have a spectrum of different views. We tell you that's an appearance. It isn't, in fact, the case. I'll go into that in my substantive. They tell you, oh, well, you'll have fewer papers under this policy. A few things we say here. Firstly, on a point of, like, debating. If it's okay for you to say, well, we're in favour of everything you could every policy you could possibly implement to improve newspapers, then it's probably okay for us to say, well, you can subsidise, like, new loss-making organisations if you want them to appear. But if you don't apply that response, I have several more. What we tell you is that our policy, no, thank you, fundamentally changes the structure of the market, right? Insofar as there is demand for these newspapers, people will still want to put them forward. They gave you no reasons for why, one, loss-making newspapers need to be funded by other newspapers as opposed to by some other source of capital, which can still happen under our policy. No, thank you. And two, no reason why people fund loss-making newspapers in the first place. Presumably, it's some sort of ideological interest. We don't see why that interest goes away. What we do give you, however, is a plurality of different people funding these loss-making newspapers. No, thank you. No, thank you. And so on. That's good. They tell you, well, they need to rely on ads and rely on like people like going through cables and trying to support themselves. Firstly, these newspapers aren't trying to make a loss under the status quo, right? They still need to do a great deal, no thank you, to appeal to advertisers. We think that interest remains in their model as well. Secondly, in order to get advertisers, you need to have people reading your paper. People have to like what they see. And thirdly, what we tell you is that, and I'll take you on this in just a second, thirdly, what we tell you is that at least this way, you're not open to one particular set of corporate interests, right? We think like a multitude of them is still going. Go ahead.
When you say you're okay with subsidies, would that be like, you know, the BBC?
Yeah, we just don't think the BBC should own multiple channels of news. 2 points of extension, or material. Correct. Firstly, international newspapers and TV channels. What we tell you here is that there's a particular harm to allowing wealthy investors to take control of national news media across the world, right? We think that if, like, Rupert Murdoch didn't exist, there would be various different sources of capital across different countries who wouldn't be able to own the newspapers and so on that he already does. Why is it particularly pernicious in a world with like global movement and freedom of capital that individuals can own like a huge multitude of media interests across the world? Very simply because their interests are likely to be even more divergent from the interests of the people reading the media that they produce, right? In terms of things like economic policy, where it may well be in America's interest for a certain like protectionist policy to be put in place on its industry, not in the interest of people reading like the Mexico Times or whatever. I'll take you just a second. In situations of foreign policy, where America, like happened in the Iraq War, may be militating to get various different countries to commit their troops to a costly and foolish invasion. We think it's a problem, then, that shareholders and individual owners based in one country set the agenda across the world. Go.
At the point at which you're willing to subsidise media, haven't you dealt with your problem of Chinese corporate interests and barriers to entry and made your own proposition irrelevant by creating one holding corporation for the state?
Sorry, I'm trying to speak here. No. For various reasons. Firstly, because people are... No, I haven't even told you why I disagree with your point. No on earth can have another point. Firstly, because people are very averse to changing what they're watching when they already have a favourite channel. Right? People are going to continue to want to get their news from Fox, even if you start up a news site for their own channel. You need to break the ability of individual people to have a stranglehold on all these spaces before you can do that. Secondly, because the amount of capital required is very difficult to compete with when you have one large organisation that owns anything. That's a massive problem. So we don't think that this remains the case. And in any case, even if subsidies would bring some benefit, the benefits from our policy flow logically from our policy according to our arguments. They still make the world a better place in either model. So, the false appearance of diversity. What we tell you here is that it is in fact not particularly the case that Fox News and the Times and so on give seriously different points of view on government policy. Rather, the ownership of various different kinds of media organisations allows the controllers of those organisations to create the appearance that the Times is like the paper of record, which takes into account like a serious reasoned argument for something, and that Fox News is a completely different organisation with a different editorial team following different policies. We think it's very difficult for individuals consuming the media to be sure if different media organisations are owned by the same people, because shareholding is often deeply opaque to individuals who don't know how to do the research and so on. And so they can easily be tricked into thinking that they're getting more than one point of view, when in fact it's all going in the same direction. It's true that the Times was eventually forced to report on the scandals within the Sun. It is not true they went out of their way to report it before someone else revealed it, and it would have looked completely ridiculous for them not to. We think it's a problem that these media organisations are seen to represent different interests when in fact they do not, and that's why we're very proud to stand on proposition. Thank you.
I thank the speaker and now invite up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to deliver the next speech.
So proposition had to do two things, right? One was to show that it's absolutely outrageous to own, more than one media outlet, as opposed to a gargantuanly big one, which could be one influencing all of us. But somehow, a few small ones might be dangerous and compelling, and we should fight against it. The second one was to show that we'd all be better off. The lifeblood of democracy would flow much better if we had this policy. Both of them were ineffective. Why was that? Well, firstly, let's look at legitimacy. Because the core case we got out of Ben was that it hurts us all, restricts democracy, because there are these huge barriers to entry that stop small players being able to fight. I mean, firstly note, by Ben's own standard, that doesn't make any sense, because he said the barrier to entry was economies of scale, which make running a large media outlet cheaper. It doesn't make running a small one any more cheaper. If you get rid of that person, it still makes it really expensive, which just means people won't run newspapers, and suddenly there's no comparative choice here between do I buy, the free newspaper or the more expensive newspaper. It's, shall I just buy Heat magazine instead, right? But personally, unless you can make other entities cheaper, that doesn't go away. But don't worry, you gave us a reason to get rid of that by saying we could subsidise. Note then that once we can subsidise competitors, we have no reason whatsoever to get rid of multiple media organisations. Why would that be? Because now you can fund other people to enter the discourse to challenge them, rather than just to take everybody out of the game and just miraculously come up with your own ideas on your own. I want to bring some ideas into this debate. The first one will be looking at the actual incentives, the actual motivations that people have at the individual level and the societal level. And secondly, I want to look at the difference, the confusion that these guys make between the free market of ideas and the free market of information. That's how we get on to the second idea then, of what happens when you get to would we be any better off. Now, firstly then, look at this idea of the motivations of people involved. They have two types, right? The first one are people with distinct ideological preferences, to quote Ben, that want to, what does he say, to marshal an electorate in their favour. People like Berlusconi, who actually are involved in politics, or people like Murdoch, who thinks wants control. The second one, actually, to be fair to them, are more benevolent than that, like the BBC, but just by their sheer weight of influence. Note the BBC only actually is one corporation, not multiple outlets. Then, passionate people influence the discussions that we have. Also note that still by subsidising other people, we can just put another voice into the discourse. What does he say? These people are involved because, as Jack said, there's only one company of newspaper that makes any money because they have something to push. You haven't made it any cheaper for anyone else to get in the market, so still the only people involved are people with something to push. It's not going to help me if I still read a newspaper that wants to push an agenda, but it just doesn't have to own some other newspapers I never read in the first place anyway. You're not improving the quality of ideas. If the problem is the people behind it want to push an agenda, all you do is you fragment that so that people are still in some kind of false consciousness, whatever you think the dangerous was. Secondly, said, the advertisers are in the status quo anyway, so they're pushing something. No, that's not the problem with advertising. Currently what you can do is mitigate the losses you are making by putting what's currently in British newspapers, about 50% of them are paid for by PR agencies. Your margin there you can assess by how big a hit can you take. When you take the only people out of the game who are huge multinationals like Murdoch with the wealth, you don't increase the number of those people that can afford to make losses. So actually all you do is decrease, or you increase the proportion of advertisers, which means fewer articles get out that give people any information whatsoever. Secondly then, let's look at the idea of this market of ideas and market of information. Because what we see in the social media which they support is this has blossomed in the last 10 years, so that every person you meet either has a Twitter tweets limited to 140 characters, or a blog to include more for discourse. What does this do? This allows the thing that they fear most, right? The discussion of what things mean, the encoded meanings you can put across when the sun can turn up in 1992, say last one out, turn off the light. People can discuss that idea of whether you're being manipulated, whether you're being changed. Note this idea that Hugh brings out then, that when you've got people with only one agenda, the kind of false idea of diversity. So you've got the Sun and the Time. But they do state things differently then. So it's very hard to encode those with the same message as people. The people who read the Sun, the people who read the Times talk to each other and discuss those ideas. They also do it on the internet where other people can find it and then go to their workplace and discuss those ideas. All the inherent biases that these guys are worried about are discussed, and that is the best way of finding out whether and fighting against those and influencing you that you can have. Note then that to have those discussions, it needs to be based information, which is what Jack tells you when you need investigative journalists that are funded, that can spend 12 hours a day looking at instances to find out when MPs are taking money from the till, to find out when phones are being hacked. These are the things that need to be found, and a blogger sits up on his sofa can't do that. A small funded newspaper can't do that. Ben?
It's not hard to encode vote Labour in your media outlet. All you've given is a list of reasons that these organisations are able to send messages to a wide range of different social groups to ultimately believe the same thing.
Oh no, it doesn't make sense, that's fine. The problem with what Ben's just said is that newspapers, find it easy to encode, and he has a system that he will get rid of, someone who owns lots of newspapers and find a way to encode them. But still hasn't responded at all to the idea that you can own one huge one and encode lots of people with one big tool, or you can have lots of different people encoding you with their ideas that still don't help you at all. What these guys have to do is improve discourse to democracy. That's Ben's opening gambit, right? He says he wants discourse to things that make us think about the policies that affect our lives each and every day, whether we should have redistributed tax, whether we should have immigration into our country. These ideas that affect us and benefit should be discussed. Can he do that with less information? No, he can't, because the problem there is you get lots of people discussing but not knowing what they're talking about, which I think most of you find intuitively from sitting through rounds 1 to 9 is not very informative or get anyone's understanding moving forward. What you need are people going out there, putting in the time and finding information, finding the facts. He says, look, okay, Hugh said, the Times did report on the Sun, but they did it reluctantly after a while. At least the information got out in the first place, and also, firstly, he says it's reluctant, but having more people going out, say, having the Times, or having state subsidising that you could enter into the market under their idea to fight their proposition, gets them out. What they have are fewer people, fewer outlets in the game, and they still have all the pernicious harms. We can break down monopolies when there's only one person talking. We can break down outrageous biases that take rid of people through regulation. All these people have done is think that a number is important rather than dominance or bias. They do nothing to hurt those harms, and we can just subsidise people anyway. That's why I'm proud to stand in opposition.
The issues not necessarily the viewpoints on her that might be true.